Right, welcome everyone to Office Hours. It's been a while. Definitely these are meant to be engineer events, like super casual. So the whole point is that people get to ask questions, get to have their input, get to overhear conversations that we're having internally about what to do with the product. And obviously we're the new stewards of Meltano and I'd love to get to know you and you to know us. I do have a couple of slides, just a couple of slides, and then it's mostly conversation. The first kind of thing is something we were chatting to Ken. Here, welcome, Ken. You're here for first attendee in a long time. Ken asked, "What's the agenda?" So I thought, actually, let's just dive into a quick overview. Basically, normally what happens is people join the calls, get to a bit of around the table. This is who they are, who do they work for. You'll see that everyone on the call today, apart from Ken, works for Meltano, works for us. So happy to do intros, but that should be quite short. In terms of the most of the agenda, there was a kind of tricky little issue where setup tools changed, breaking changed. Loads of people had some pain around plugins. So kind of the bulk of the discussion today is about how do we think about that stability? How do we think about adding plugins? Yeah, that's kind of part of the motive of starting with talking about plugins. And then, probably a point in everyone's thought processes is what are we doing with the product? And so a little discussion at the end about what we think is cool, what we're working on, what other people think is cool. So probably worth me stopping sharing at this point. Guys, a quick around the table. As it appears on my screen, Ed, you're up first. If you want to just say a quick hello.
Hey everyone. I'm Edgar. I'm software engineer at Meltano. Been here for, what is it now? Almost 5 years at this point. Yeah, super thrilled to have office hours back and yeah, have more feedback and interact with our community.
And you are you're one of the originals. So on my screen, actually, Akhilesh is next. But Ken, I'm going to go straight to you because it kind of makes more sense. Why don't you say a quick hello?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone watching this in the future. I'm Ken. He spent, I think, 2 years at Meltano. Edgar, I can't remember the order anymore. I think I was just after you, but in the first like 3 or 4 after it spun out of GitLab. Thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm now with Gusto, the UK-based and now Republic of Ireland mailbox kit company. So part of the data platform team, building a data mesh, hoping to use Meltano for the internal API integrations and some third-party ones as well. Specifically, very interested in OpenAPI, making sure that we don't have to build custom taps for all our internal integrations because that still places data engineering resource, in between a software engineer and an analyst or a product manager aligned to the same squad. We have cross-functional squads. So yeah, that's very much the thrust of my interest in Meltano.
Well, welcome. Thanks for jumping on. And yeah, there's many of the faces that we hope to see again on these calls. It's awesome to have you on our first call in a while. Kalesh, I'll come to you. Just a quick intro. Tell us how you help Meltano. That'd be quite cool for everyone to know just who you are and how you help.
It's me. Oh, hi. Akhilesh here. I take care of marketing at Meltano. It's been few months since I joined, and yeah, super excited to be here and kickstart Office Hours again. I've heard a lot of good things from Edgar about how good Office Hours for the community. So super excited to get it started.
Thanks, mate. And it's actually a really super important thing. So Akhilesh keeps us honest, keeps the calls happening. Yeah, it would be so easy to delay these and not get on. So actually having you organize it is super important. Good, but I'm going to come to you next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Ruben. I used to be a regular at these things too, but as a community member and not as a employee of Meltanos. Although I've been in my position for like coming up on 6 years now, it's I guess really different being on this side of the fence this time. Yeah, looking forward to seeing what we can continue to offer. Now we are Meltano and carrying on with that. My day to day is fixing plugins, front end, back end, all sorts of stuff. And so yeah, interested to dig into plugins today.
Cool. Thanks, Ruben. I don't know if Dan's going to go camera on or speak. But,
Dan's a
I
viewer
guess.
today. Oh,
I'm a guest. I wasn't invited here, but I work here. I work for Meltano. I'm a analytics engineer. I am actually here in a more personal capacity. I have a question around EDK and custom plugins, which I think maybe ties in with stuff today.
I think, I'm obviously a founder of Meltano. I like to say founder of Meltano now. It's a bit weird saying that. It's kind of like, I'm still the founder of the company that is Meltano, but, contributed to Meltano. Like, I was obviously super invested in, for a long time what the product did and users and, to be helping us and navigate a path forward to being super useful to tons of people. It's cool and exciting to me, and as an engineer, I feel like the thing that really like sticks with me is that it's rare that you get to work on something like important. And it feels like Meltano is just really important to a lot of people and a lot of important to us. But yeah, so I definitely feel the responsibility and the excitement that comes along with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to kind of a discussion now. I think, Dan, we're going to hear your question after this kind of discussion around plugins. And then Ken, I think you said you had a couple of things that you wanted to raise as well, perhaps. The first discussion, if we just hand over to Ruben and Edgar, why don't you tell us about the kind of setup tools issue, what caused it? I see lots of conversation about the pain that it caused various people, which obviously leads into what can we do about it. So yeah, I don't know if you guys have already decided who's going to explain the issue, but someone dive in and shout out what kind of the pain was.
I can call out the impact. I think Edgar is more detail on like the technical why it happened or where it happened specifically in setup tools. So I'll just give like a bit of a contextual outline. I can't remember what day it was specifically, but some morning we just had a bunch of plugins fail to run in a bunch of customer workspaces. It was caused by this breaking change that was made in setup tools that they had sort of been alluding to happening for like months or maybe even years, but it caused a big uproar in the whole Python community in general. So much so that I think they were reverting things or talking about reverting things, despite having numerous discussions in the past about it. So I think mostly a communication issue as much as a Python ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, setup tools and the whole ecosystem around it is like part of not exactly legacy Python, but a lot of legacy projects rely on setup tools. And the issue is that in all Python versions, there was some overlap between what setup tools distributes, because when you install setup tools, you get not only setup tools, you get some other packages. I think right now the breaking changes that setup tools actually released had to do with removing those extra packages that used to come with setup tools. All Python versions used to provide some of those, but then the pip installer also came with some of those libraries. When you installed with pip, it auto like injected those tools there. But with the newer Python versions, different installers like UB, all those things are usually not available. So a new set of tools that removes one of those packages can break a lot of things, because now there's a transitive dependency that was never like explicitly declared. And so when you try to install a package that depends on that, relies on that, it breaks, it crashes. So yeah, I think that's everything that's not based on the Singer SDK, everything that's based on older versions of the Singer SDK is affected by that. So yeah, hopefully with porting more and more plugins to the SDK, we see fewer and fewer of those kinds of issues. Yeah.
And we tried to major problems out on the Meltano Slack when they happened. This was done in the past before Meltano changed hands, but we did this for this particular change and suggested a fix for everyone. The beauty of Meltano is that it's built on this concept of supplying a pip URL. So oftentimes you can patch the pip URL with like an explicit dependency on something else, or like an explicit version to stop that change occurring. So in this case, you could like pin it to a previous version of setup tools to stop that new one coming in.
Yep. So the reason I threw this slide up is that I'm probably thinking about the benefits of the SDK, how you build obviously connectors, how you build utilities. It's kind of always someone's problem that, if there are dependencies and a kind of like framework to fit into, and you're adding features to this and, supporting the library part of it. I tend to think a little bit more about the distribution part of it. So like a long time ago, I helped define the requirements around what the hub would look like, around what plugins, how they would get into the, into the Meltano, because like actually being able to update something and if someone has fixed it upstream is sort of, that's part of completing the the fix for someone. And often the pain is getting it, not just someone looking after it. So maybe, Edgar, you could tell us a little bit about these different parts, like what the SDK is, EDK, or the hub is, just to sort of refresh about what these different parts.
Yeah. So the Singer SDK was one of the very first projects that started after Meltano was put out of GitLab 5 years ago. It's a Python library for building extractors, or what in the Singer ecosystem are called tabs, and loaders. So basically just for data movement. It builds on top of the specification, the Singer specification, which uses pipes to move data from the tab to the target, and JSON messages to communicate both the data and also the metadata, the schema, and what are like the unique keys and incremental replication and all those things. All those are communicated with JSON messages, and the SDK lets you work on a higher level, worry more about like how you map what are called the streams. So like a data set to an endpoint or a database table without really thinking about like what's happening under the hood with the Singer specification. So that's the Singer SDK. The EDK was a more recent thing that came after we introduced the concept of utilities and wanted to like decouple things like DBT and Airflow that were like very coupled with internals of Meltano, get them out of the core and into their own plugins. They do things like initializing your DBT project or an Airflow project and making sure they work with how Meltano is set up, the project layout and all those things. There are not a lot of EDK based plugins, so like with the SDK, which are probably hundreds and hundreds of mostly tabs built on the SDK. With the ADK, it's mostly things like Airflow, Daxter. I think there's a superset ADK plugin. There's DBT plugins for all the major warehouses. So that covers tab targets. Forgot to mention the SDK also lets you build what are called mappers. So you can think of as a buffer or as something you put in between an extractor and a loader that lets you do things like masking data, flattening, that kind of thing that you probably don't want to do on the transformation layer. You want the data to land in a specific format with specific transformations before or when it lands in the data warehouse. And now you have that whole ecosystem of tab targets, mappers, and utilities. How do you integrate them in your project? That's where the hub comes in. It's a repository of hundreds, I think around 6 connectors between tab targets and utilities. When you do Meltano add, under the hood, Meltano is calling the hub and getting the plugin definition for you and locking that in your project so that it's a stable definition, so that even if the plugin upstream changes, like it has new settings or a setting kind of changes, you still have the same plugin definition and your project is more or less stable. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But even though there are hundreds of plugins, there are still probably orders of magnitude more sources available out there. So you will inevitably probably have to build a custom plugin. So you can do that in line inside your Meltano YAML project. You can project file, you can find custom plugins there. So that's more or less a summary of plugin ecosystem.
Thanks, Edgar. I think one of the kind of cool things about this forum is that everyone gets to see how we think about it internally. And there's probably an elephant in the room that I should bring up and want to bring up. So building a plugin, whether it's a connector or an EDK, is relatively straightforward. And it's Claude is pretty successful at building a connector and building on top of the SDK. It can benefit from a couple of hints, like use the Meltano SDK or a skill to like go off and understand how to do a few things. But I'd like to bring up DLT and how connectors are built with other kind of open source type technologies. And my impression, like I speak to a lot of people about Meltano and connectors, and people still say it's quite difficult, even though like Claude can do it. like actually understanding what's going on is sort of a relatively big step for a lot of people thinking about a connector. Whereas my impression is that the step to build the DLT connector feels lower for a lot of people. I don't know whether that's because it's like completely self-contained within Python and they feel like they can see a bit more of what's going on, or that because Meltano is like handling a lot of things like, okay, it's dealing with states, dealing with schema, it's dealing with Python virtual environment, it's dealing with config, it's dealing with quite a lot of things just over and above making a simple connection. So maybe it's a good one for you, Ken. I sort of wonder, like building connectors is probably easy for you, but do you have an opinion on what it's like building in DLT or alternatives? What's your impression?
Yeah, it is a really great question. I was actually just, I haven't looked at DLT for a while. I think the last time I looked at it, it looked sort of very notebook driven. We're big Databricks users at Gusto. And so that like notebook experience is a really common one. It's kind of a first class citizen in Databricks. They'll try hard to convince you that a notebook can also be a pipeline if you schedule it. It's not our favorite pattern, but we have data scientists and others who are less familiar with the pipeline concepts and much happier just running notebooks. So I think there definitely is productivity there, but it's the productionization that is the hard part. And I think that's the line that Meltano sits on the other side of. You know, what we were talking about earlier with the version changes and version pinning, each tap and target is a self-contained project. You can publish it to PyPy or to some internal repo. You can version it. We use versioning heavily internally. We have our own closed source implementation of target Databricks. We're adding features all of the time, and they aren't always backwards compatible as we learn stuff both about Databricks and I remember stuff about the SDK. So we really value the software and packaging best practices that you inherit from them being standalone. But we appreciate that the people who are working on it have software engineering experience and are comfortable with that as a paradigm. I think if we were trying to expose connectors to our data scientists, to our analytics engineers who are perfectly capable of writing software or writing code, but maybe haven't ever packaged something, published it to a repository, or had to think about, you know, semantic versioning, I think the barrier to entry is that much higher. So I think it's a trade-off between productivity and accessibility and effectively productionization. Is this something you're comfortable the company depending on, or is this something that you're doing for a POC or a hackathon, and it's just running in your environment?
Yeah. I definitely couldn't have said it better. There is a stat that I recall as you were talking that through. I was reading what this sort of market, you know, let's say, you know, penetration of, you know, different vendors is. And I think the thing I was reading was trying to make a case for Fivetran being about 22%, something like that. Airbyte being 15, 17%, something like that. Custom, like script based connectors, 19%. And then Meltano is actually quite impressive, 8%. You know, quite a sort of popular chunk of how people build things. And it did surprise me, like that custom way of building things. I suppose if it's quick, it starts out quite simple. You think, I'll just build this one thing. And then it becomes a sort of, you know, legacy that someone has to look after and that someone could leave, and, you know, productionization. I see that as like a you know, burden for a company that they just probably shouldn't have. Yeah, super.
Yeah, I'm grinning like a Cheshire cat because the custom API integrations that we inherited were scheduled Lambda functions with a custom DynamoDB checkpointing solution on top. Scheduled Lambda function would run, it would push the messages onto SNS SQS, which would end up getting filtered to S3 via Kinesis. So like people are building real things to fit this use case. And I'd love to go back to my predecessors and just be like, try Meltano before you build another custom Lambda function. Implement your connector as a handler. Try Meltano because it'll do tons for you. So yeah, I think the struggle is definitely real for those of us inheriting integrations.
Probably, but maybe an unpopular opinion. It is actually tempting to think that an engineer, and I've probably been in this position, would like to just try out a technology, would like to just build something. It's almost the kind of like the proverbial mountain to climb. I'd like to see if I could do it. Yeah, I feel like maybe that's the kind of AI world. It enables a lot of building, a lot of like that kind of, yeah, I wonder if people feel like that.
Maybe it's worth calling out. There is a plugin that I think quite a lot of people in Meltano or people who use Meltano have used to sort of like prototype what a custom connector might look like. In I think it's Cat REST API that's also built on the MSDK, which is basically just like a wrap around the SDK exposing certain parts of it so that you can describe a connector purely through config. I've seen a lot of people start out this way. I think generally the recommendation is definitely a good starting point, but productionizing that like as config generally is preferred like in a custom connector at the end of the day, just to obviously so this version, as Ken said, and is more stable around that. But I think it's probably a good like first introduction to what a custom connector in Meltano can look like and how insofar as how you configure and run it.
Yeah, we are running Tap REST API in production, and it is a glimpse into a better future from my perspective. I think I mentioned in the preamble that we are very interested in OpenAPI and being able to programmatically retrieve things like the schema from an endpoint, and even so far as using custom annotations within that schema to specify the other config you would need to run a data integration. So being able to mark a primary key and a replication key using the X dash prefixes. What that would enable for us internally is not having to write custom connectors for our internal APIs, as long as we can agree as a company what our pagination looks like, some kind of guardrails for what a good internal API looks like. If we build one tap that's using the OpenAPI external schema functionality that Edgar released a few months ago, maybe 6 or 7 months now, it's been a while since I checked, that allows us to essentially define an integration as config. And we've built an orchestration system around that with a relational database, stores the config, allows the config to be stored and published from an internal team's GitHub repo. So they own that config. They tell us which resources on their endpoint that they actually want to publish. And everything downstream of that is owned by us as a central team. They describe a schedule and we actually schedule and run it. And so I actually think that connector as config is hugely powerful in opening up effectively something like Fivetran for internal use cases. Fivetran is ClickOps for the pure experience, but they do have a Terraform provider if you're brave. It is possible to run Fivetran as config driven, but it's also possible to run it with Meltano, and definitely the OpenAPI unlocks lots of that. If the user doesn't have to give you 300 lines of config, including their schema, including the replication keys, including the scheduling, if they could just tell you the endpoints they want and point you at their, or you rely on the default OpenAPI documentation endpoint. I think it's docs.json or docs.yaml, depending on how you want to retrieve it. All they have to tell you is the endpoint name and the schedule, and everything else the tap will be able to either infer or use conventions for. So this is a feature, not a bug, I think.
Yeah, yeah. That's a super interesting way of thinking about it. And is the objective there that you have a discoverable data product catalog, or at least a way to onboard into a catalog with just far less friction? Is that sort of the motive?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this is the sort of changing nature of data engineering and maybe the rise of platform engineering, rather than the centralized data engineering team working through a backlog of integrations on behalf of the company and implementing those as bespoke code, either as a custom Meltano connector or that big chunk of other. We provide as a platform team a golden pathway, a way for you to register your endpoint that you've built internally in a config-driven way, in a way that config is versionable, in a way that the tooling fits in with your CI/CD. The platform team is responsible for actually executing the integrations. We own the Meltano expertise. We understand how the system works. If a scheduled run doesn't run, we would get the page and we would pick up the work to make sure that the connectors are running. But if a particular integration fails, ideally you'd find out about it in CI/CD because your config was wrong, and we have got a whole lot of config validation. Or if it fails in production, we actually send you the page. You have the config, you can change the behavior of the endpoint. It's probably your API that's inaccessible. And so we really want to move from being just like pipeline factory, a very service-oriented data engineering function, to that sort of platform. We provide a service that is integrations. We will conform the integrations golden pathway to how the software engineers want to build APIs. There is a certain amount, as I said, around pagination, authentication that will be company specific that maybe a completely generic tap OpenAPI wouldn't be able to cater for. OpenAPI is a documentation format, not a specification. You can still build hideous APIs and give them an OpenAPI description. So like we still have the job of encouraging the engineers to like talk to each other and build APIs in one way. But if they do that, the benefit really is that we can stop thinking about ourselves as pipeline engineers and start thinking about ourselves as service owners for the business.
Yeah. I feel like I could go on this topic for quite a while. Actually, again, at this point, so future episode, watch this space, because the thing that I immediately think of is we'll get into MCP servers, we'll get into like to what degree do you need a highly coupled, understanding the schema. Yeah, we've got tons we could talk about that. So no, let's move on to the next set of slides. This is back to the kind of pinning setup tools, ways to achieve production grade stability. And I think this is probably a space for you, Edgar, or let's get back to the Ruben and Edgar show. Like, let's talk us through pinning.
So my laptop battery is about to die, so I'm going to need to go grab a charger. So I guess for a second.
All right, yeah. So like with the setup tools issue that we mentioned at the beginning, one way that we could have, or users of Meltano could have prevented that was by pinning all their project dependencies or the plugin dependencies. I think Ruben or you, Aaron, mentioned that there's what's called a pip URL where you declare what your plugin depends on. Right now, there's ways to you can declare all your dependencies there and pin them there, but it's a mess. You probably don't want to do that, and especially you probably don't want to maintain a huge string of pinned dependencies. There are other ways around that, like you can have a requirements file where you pin your dependencies. I think, Ruben, you want to say something? Yeah.
Sorry, no, I was just sitting down and clicked that box.
Cool. So yeah, there are ways around that. You can have a requirements file and you put that requirements file into your pip URL configuration in Meltano. And that's a way to have a log file, essentially. But it's not native to Meltano, and you have to maintain that log file yourself by other means, like UB or what it's called, pip tools tool. Yeah, but it's not ideal and definitely not very user friendly.
I don't know if you called it out while I was changing rooms. Surprised I'm in a different room now. One of the most upvoted, if not the most upvoted issue on Meltano is pinning plugin dependencies in the log file. So there have been, I think, a couple of attempts at how we can support that natively. I think one of them was to basically shove in what is the requirements txt output of a plugin into that log file. So it becomes like a proper log file insofar as freezing the definition of the plugin and all the dependencies and like direct and transitive dependencies of that. But I think there's a sort of like a separate process that would need to run to then put that in the log file. Not fully fleshed out, but definitely explored in a couple of ways.
Yeah, there's details around that we either need to change how like a plugin maps to its log file, or have the log definition, the log plugin dependencies or the pinned plugin dependencies separate from the log file. Because right now, there's this concept of variants. So for a plugin in the hub or externally, there could be one or more variants. So for example, like for tap Postgres, there's at least 4 or 5 variants of that. There's a Meltano one, there's a pipeline-wise one. So each of those different variants, of course, has like different settings and details. And so if you add both to your project, you would end up with different log files for those. But then if you also have a plugin inheritance, you have a plugin that is a child of another plugin, Meltano supports that. It inherits by default the pip URL where you define your version constraints, but you can override that pip URL in your inherited plugin. So if right now, because an inherited plugin shares the plugin definition, if we put the pin dependencies in the log file, an inherited plugin with a different pip URL would have the same pin dependencies as its parent plugin, which would not work for us. So we'd either have to put the requirements or the dependencies outside, or split the log files for like inherited plugins, essentially. Does that make sense, Ruben?
Yeah.
It's probably going too much into the details, but that's where we are with
I feel like the
design.
is kind of the important bit when you want runtime consistency. I might just open up a kind of the conversation a little bit to the different approaches. Like you could containerize, you could have a runtime consistency just like you might do for a particular connector and use a container, like so container to container. It certainly adds some weight to the runtime. Well, there's sort of nice things about Python virtual environment, Python dependencies are still fairly light. I think there are other approaches like sort of containerize the whole environment, sort of you get consistency there. Then maybe some other approaches that are kind of like to somewhere in between, kind of a binary deployment kind of approach. Actually, I think there's something in Python, I can't quite remember the name of it. There's like kind of binary packaging.
Slides, I think.
Yeah. And Ken, what are you doing, if anything, to achieve that kind of runtime stability?
We are containerizing. So we compile a Meltano container with the specific taps and targets installed at CI/CD at deployment time. And so our containers are essentially frozen. That's the way we're doing it. It's our entire Meltano container. So the plugins still get a virtual environment within the container as part of Meltano install.
That's our approach too, actually. That's our approach to stabilize a workspace at a known version and obviously not install it at runtime. It doesn't add so much friction to the users. So I think during dev time, like adding dependencies, adding projects, adding you wouldn't want to experience a kind of containerization at that moment. I do sort of wonder, like at that software use case, but the main benefit to me, at least, that I foresee is able to run with different Python versions, different dependencies. So one tap is not dependent on another. So that's a really important aspect, is that a virtual environment isolates a connector entirely. I think that may well be a weakness of DLT, is that there's no isolation at the connector level. There's no virtual environment. You have to package the entire thing in your project. So it won't be long before there is some weird kind of transitive dependency issue where one connector uses different HTTP library or a different logging something or other. And before you know it, you've got some kind of dependency hell just to try and resolve, even with a relatively simple project. Guys, any other potential issues you think like plugin level isolation solves? Go on, Ken.
Maybe not. One of the things that we ran into was we were using the Meltano latest Docker image, and we noticed, I think it was last week or the week before, the Meltano version was downgraded from 4 to 3.8 inside the image randomly. And that was a bit of a surprise to us. It killed a few pipelines. I wasn't sure if it was related to the setuptools fix or whether it was a bug in the CI pipelines, but we definitely experienced there were breaking changes between 3 and 4, specifically around the config list. And the first thing our containers do is list the path config so that if we go into the logs, we can see exactly, we can check that our config injection via environment variables was working. And so that was our canary in the coal mine. Our containers spun up. They tried to run the new 4.0 version of Meltano config and were failing. The config command was wrong. It was resolving to the 3.8 version. So we have now pinned to v4 Docker images, but that's another kind of vector here where, like, even if your project is perfectly pinned, if you're not Docker, not using the Docker pins for the Meltano wrapper, you can still run into issues. I actually wanted to ask what happened there and whether you guys noticed it.
I think I know what happened. So we did a backport release of, I think, 3.9. So that's maybe what you were saying. And I think I didn't think of that when we do a release, like a pack release, we automatically publish the latest to the Docker Hub. And I don't check if it's actually the latest version. So we overwrite whatever was there to begin with. So I think that was the issue.
The last built one ended up becoming the latest. So 3.9 built, 3.4 built.
Yeah.
All right, that's something for us to work on. That's definitely an undesirable behavior.
Yeah, I think if we had just been running Meltano run, we would have been fine. It would have worked. And as I said, we've now pinned to, Python 3.13, Meltano 4 or whatever, that there are the Docker tags at that granularity. So it was probably a bad thing that we were doing. But yeah, it just goes to this pinning conversation of, pin your connectors so that you know which version of tap or target you're getting. And then if you're using Docker, pin to a Meltano and Python version so you know what you're getting.
Yeah.
Probably one for the community, one for the Slack group, perhaps. But the kind of question: should we make pinning by default? What does good dependency look like? I think it's going to continue as user adoption continues. To be an issue that arises only at the point of pain. So we'll try to have a group of people think about that future point of pain. Might go to the next slide. I can see we're having tons of fun and eating into the hour. Anything you'd like to jump into here, Edgar? This would be probably your sweet spot.
Yeah, with the setup tools issue that happened a couple of months ago, most of the affected plugins, I think, were either not implemented in the SDK or using an old SDK version. So one of the issues that is solved by porting old and existing plugins to the SDK is you get an actively maintained library that I'm very eager to address any warnings or deprecations that come from upstream. So you get those benefits by default. There's another functional benefits from building on top of the SDK, like here mentioned retries for like APIs are never perfect, right? They have weird transient errors. So those are automatically handled and retried a couple of times by the SDK. Stream maps let you mask sensible information, flatten your data, things like that, without like changing the plugin itself. You can rename fields or rename streams, things like that. Metrics, which in Meltano Cloud now, that they are automatically processed and used to give you high-level information about like how many records were synced in your stream. So by using the SDK, you get the benefit of having that information out of the box. Incremental replication is very easy to do. You basically just declare a replication key and then use a couple of methods to like filter your data based on that. Recent good examples of porting plugins to the SDK are tapping ads, which I think Ruben worked on. It's on the Matitica org in GitHub, and Tap Greenhouse in Meltano Labs, which Ken might be interested in looking at Tap Greenhouse because it's based on OpenAPI, and it has a single stream definition, and it reads all the properties, the schemas, everything from the OpenAPI document. So that's probably one step closer to what you're interested in, Ken. So maybe we'll look at that. A feature enhancement. We have a lot of feature requests and things I think we internally want to work on to make easier to develop on the SDK, reduce the boilerplate. Yeah, things like that. Ruben, anything you had missed here?
Yeah, well, Edgar does a great job maintaining the SDK repo. So quick shout out to him. Does a great job. We're the main consumers of, well, obviously we are consumers of the taps that we have built ourselves for the SDK. So we have an active interest in maintaining that. There was another issue that occurred recently where some upstream package had a CVE. And so we had a quick patch for that and a backport fix for the SDK versions for that. So we're often the first people to run into problems with the SDK and also then to patch the SDK. So there's that nice sort of cyclic relationship there of maintenance and sort of piggybacking off like the OpenAPI spec. I don't want to go back to that too much because we spent quite a long time talking about it. But we also, as well as tapping ads, which was a recent one we rebuilt, we're constantly rebuilding taps that we found like on some old like Singer library version as feeling a bit rough around the edges and pick it up and rebuild it. Or just building new sources generally, like the Singer SDK docs are so good that you can just, like Aaron mentioned at the start, point Claude at and say, go and build me like a Singer SDK tap, and it will oftentimes one-shot it, if not mostly get there. I started one for a service called Apten, but with AI, and it did mostly get the whole way through with some minor tweaks from my side. But the reason I call out that one is that it's quite similar to the OpenAPI spec in that Apten is built on the OData API protocol. And so quite a lot of it is self-describing through the API. There's a metadata endpoint which describes the available entities, and you can sort of like dynamically build the streams. At the end of the day, all the specific configuration to the Apten tap is replication keys because the API describes primary keys. I see an enhancement to the SDK in the future that is just sort of like an OData stream or even just like an OData tap. You describe the tap, you give it a name, and you define like the replication keys for the stream, and then you're away. That being like a 5-minute process, you can like build a custom connector. Or even if it was like tap OData, and then you describe that through config. Either way, the SDK made it super easy to build that. And Bing ads and all the other ones we've done. Yes, it's pretty easy to get into. The docs are great.
Cool. Thanks. Probably a good point to come to your question, Dan. I don't know if you've had it answered already or it kind of fits into this, but sort of thought as we got into the SDK entails, maybe it does get to your question.
Yeah, mine's more just throwing out what I've been thinking about to the room. Utilities in Meltano. I built some utilities a long time ago that are just effectively like click CLI Python packages that fit nicely into Meltano and the commands and all that structure. There's some that I built recently with the EDK. There are others built with EDK. And then I came across one this week, which has been there a while, SQL Fluff, which I didn't realize was more or less just a pip install of the SQL Fluff repo wrapped in a plugin definition that exposes some commands and lets you do the SQL Fluff things, as opposed to like the elementary EDK plugin, for example, also wraps a CLI and is a bit more in control of, I guess, what the user's interacting, how the user is interacting. I guess it was just EDK feels like the baseline for me making a new utility. But having seen this SQL Fluff way of doing it as just a wrapper, do we think that's it's viable, but is it a best practice? Is it a way we're looking at going? I guess it ties into the stuff we've just been talking about because it points to like an unpinned SQL Fluff pip URL. So we could again be at the mercy of slipping dependencies here. But for lightweight things, that feels like a good idea. I've only ever seen it used once.
I guess my 2 pence, it would be great if Meltano was so popular and the platform was so popular that if you're developing a data tool, that you just developed it, that it could be deployed in one of the form factors that is Meltano. And it could be, obviously run on your own cloud, or it could be I feel that's what the kind of EDK possibility is that it just becomes easy to describe. This is what I offer as a tool, and then it can be deployed somewhere with very minimal descriptive effort.
Yeah, I think for lightweight tools, it probably does make sense to maybe even not use the EDK. Is that the case for the SQL Fluff utility then, that they're not using the EDK, right?
I don't think so. It looks like it's just
the
pip URL is SQL Fluff.
Yeah. I mean, for very simple tools that don't like messaging the commands or things like that to fit more into what Meltano is trying to do, it makes sense to have that more lightweight approach. You run into the issue of again, not having pin dependencies. I think Ken is
Ken
to us.
No, I mean, I think I have 2 things to offer. There's an interesting case in it's the evidence dev extension. So evidence is a static sites driven BI tool. So you generate your visualizations during CI, and then they just get published to GitHub pages or S3 buckets, and it's lends itself quite well to batch processes where you're only refreshing the data every half hour. So why would you have a long running service just polling stale data every time a user goes onto it? A really cool project. It's actually node based, and so it wasn't an obvious one that we could just bring into Meltano, but we were able to do it. There is a PyPy node wrapper that essentially installs a standalone version of Node on the path, and it essentially builds a Node virtual environment or installs Node within the Python virtual environment. And so the EDK is just wrapping a Node CLI. The commands defined in the EDK just pass straight through to the NPM versions of that command, but it allows us to bring tools built for other ecosystems, for other languages into Meltano, which is really cool. Again, I don't want to railroad the last, well, we're over the zero time we've got left, but I did wonder what the future of Meltano is for things like these extensions. I know Meltano's had multiple visions over its life cycle. It sort of, for a while, was the single tool you use to collect all of the disparate tools of the data world into one project. If that's still the case, then all this stuff is relevant and valuable. I think if it isn't, if Meltano is focusing more on the EL ETL space, some of this is being carried. It contributes to kind of blow to the project. So yeah, super interested in the roadmap discussion that went.
Well, on that note, and as we are near the end, I might skip over this approaches containerization. Actually, I have a nice slide that we could have referred to earlier. I'm going to get us to what we're working on and essentially wrap up, I suppose. So, yeah, I mean, the future is on my mind continuously, and as you can see from what we're kind of working on, new connectors is continuously happening and is continuously like what our main go-to-market is. Solving that problem, it's still unsolved in my mind. Efficiency versus other providers, availability of connectors, custom or SaaS tools, or the way they're working, batch and streaming. There's still like a space in a connectors world where that needs to be solved. I think like more pertinent to us, having acquired Meltano, we've got a bunch of connectors in the Metatica space that need to go into Meltano Labs, and I think that's kind of what I'd call out there is that Meltano Labs is the main community space for connectors. So community maintained, forever open source. Hardened connectors for things that are already built and maintained. I don't think a world where everyone's creating a connector is great for anyone. And, kind of it's immediately spinning up another custom script with some AI just feels like a waste of energy, still a burden to everyone. I think then we kind of get into actually the hub and the many, many variants. I think that our mission should be to have one variant and one good variant, and the capability of all those variants is sort of boiled down into one. And where I think agents are the best tool for everyone is that it's now plausible to have a connector ecosystem that grows really fast and hardened connectors that are an agentic code building workflow that are reviewed by skilled people, us, and then they are available to everyone, whereas it was completely unattainable before. The effort to build 600 connectors is not impossible. So I kind of see these as related, like three different things all pointing at the same kind of solution. Is a hardened connector ecosystem that's available to everyone and growing really fast. I think the other link to the agent world that I make is that if you're building your data project and agents are helping you maintain it, then a workflow that helps you put it somewhere that's running, and whether that's us or somewhere else, infrastructure is kind of a really important path. It's great to be able to build something quickly, but if it doesn't look like production, isn't usable by a enterprise in the wild, then it's sort of almost no use to anyone. And I think that becomes the data engineering that we should be solving. Is really how do companies reduce the overall cost of looking after that infrastructure? That's what I see our mission as. Different tools, capabilities of platform, they are white space, but sort of feel later. Like you need the data to play first. Like you need the sort of the platform to be useful first. Then you can kind of go about like all the different kind of cool capabilities, if you like. That's kind of my general thinking. I think probably on that note, I'll probably wrap it up and then just thank everyone for watching. Thank everyone on the call. There'll be tons more on these topics we've dived into, tons more on what we're working on in future office hours. But yeah, cool. Really great to get started again. And thanks for everyone for joining. See you soon.